My friend, let's talk about silence, not as a punishment, but as a strategic reset. In a world that's constantly talking, texting, reacting, silence becomes powerful. If you've been showing up, giving, engaging, investing, and suddenly pull back, not because you're angry, not because you're ghosting, but because you're self-aware, it creates contrast. That contrast is what makes someone take notice. When used deliberately, is one of the most underappreciated tools in relationships, especially in the early or uncertain stages. Most people associate silence with emotional distance, conflict, or disinterest. But in truth, silence, when applied intentionally and with the right mindset, is a form of communication. It's not the absence of speaking, it's the presence of space. And space is powerful because space introduces contrast. If you always show up, always respond, always initiate, always say yes, your presence becomes a given, not because you aren't valuable, but because human psychology adapts quickly to what is consistent and guaranteed. What once felt exciting, rare, or precious becomes part of the background noise. And when that happens, your presence no longer evokes the same emotional weight it once did. Now imagine you introduce a gap. Quietly, calmly, and without drama, you stop initiating, you stop chasing, you don't announce it, you don't explain it, you simply pause. That pause is not about disappearing, it's about shifting the dynamic. Suddenly, your absence is felt, not in a manipulative way, but in a felt way. The emotional rhythm changes, and in that contrast, the person on the other side begins to notice what's missing. This is the emotional contrast most people don't realize they're missing in their relationships. When someone always knows where they stand with you without ever having to earn it or reciprocate, it creates comfort, but often that comfort leads to emotional laziness. And that's where attraction begins to wane. It's not that they don't care, it's that they've stopped feeling the energy that initially drew them in. They stop feeling your presence as something they have to hold on to. And silence helps you bring that feeling back, not by being passive-aggressive, but by allowing the connection to breathe. The beauty of emotional contrast is that it wakes the other person up. When someone is used to having your attention, your compliments, your energy, and then they feel a shift, they don't just notice the silence. They begin to question it. Where did she go? Why hasn't she called? Is something wrong? These questions are incredibly powerful because they flip the emotional script. Instead of you chasing reassurance, they begin to seek clarity. And when they seek clarity, it often leads to a new level of attention or realization, one that can't be manufactured through words, but only through experience. But here's the key. Emotional contrast only works when your silence is rooted in self-respect, not in resentment. If you go silent and obsessively wait for a reaction, you haven't really created contrast. You've just paused the chase. But if your silence is grounded in confidence, if it comes from a place of saying, I know what I bring, I don't need to overextend to prove it, then your absence carries weight. That's when people feel it. That's when the balance begins to shift. As most people are so afraid of being forgotten that they keep showing up, hoping to stay relevant. Ironically, the need to constantly be seen often makes you invisible. But when you trust your value enough to create space, when you go silent, not as a tactic, but as a boundary, you become memorable. You become the person who doesn't just fill a void, but creates one when you leave. And that is far more impactful than any perfectly crafted message or romantic gesture. Then is not about playing games. It's about resetting perception. It's about giving both people in the connection a chance to feel instead of constantly react. It's about stepping out of the role of constant giver and inviting the other person to step up, reach out, or reflect. It's about contrast, presence versus absence, noise versus stillness, effort versus space. And in that contrast, people often discover what they truly value. So if you've been over-delivering in a connection, if you've been the one always reaching, always explaining, always fixing, consider this. What if your next step isn't more effort, but less? Not to punish, not to control, but to create the space that lets the other person feel the truth of what you bring by letting them feel what it's like without you. When you're constantly in communication with someone, especially someone you're romantically interested in, there's rarely any room for reflection. The connection becomes a continuous stream of interaction, messages, calls, check-ins, updates. It feels natural, even exciting in the beginning, but over time, that constant contact removes the space needed for the other person to miss you or even to think about you deeply. Reflection is a powerful psychological process, and without space, it doesn't happen. This is where intentional silence becomes your ally, not as a reaction, but as a strategic pause to invite awareness, curiosity, and clarity on their side. You interrupt the emotional rhythm they've grown used to. You create a moment of pause in a pattern that's become predictable. That silence is not empty. It's filled with questions. And those questions begin to stir in their mind. Where is she? Is she pulling away? Did I do something wrong? Was I taking her for granted? These aren't questions that arise when someone is constantly being reassured of your presence. They emerge only when you take a step back, and that step back allows them to step forward. This isn't about punishing someone by removing attention. It's about giving them the gift of their own perspective. People need room to feel your impact. They need time to wonder, to notice the absence of your energy, your thoughtfulness, your emotional investment. When you're always there, they don't have the mental space to appreciate what that means. Your effort gets filed under normal. But when you pull back in a quiet, self-respecting way, they start seeing you through a different lens. The silence causes them to engage with their own feelings. Instead of reacting to your messages or taking in your energy passively, they now have to face what they feel without external prompting. Do they miss you? Do they care enough to reach out? Are they realizing how much they were leaning on your consistency? Those are crucial questions, and only they can answer them. But they won't even begin to ask those questions if they're still wrapped in the comfort of your constant presence. One of the most underestimated parts of attraction is internal realization. When a person comes to a conclusion on their own, without being told, pressured, or prompted, it lands deeper. If you tell someone how amazing you are and why they should appreciate you, it may come across as persuasive at best or desperate at worst. But if they feel the absence of your presence and come to that conclusion themselves, wow, I miss her energy, or I didn't realize how much I relied on her support, that insight becomes much more meaningful, and the motivation that comes from that realization is authentic. It's not reactionary, it's internal. This is the shift from external validation to internal clarity. You're no longer trying to prove your worth. You're giving them the opportunity to realize it on their own. And that's a more sustainable dynamic in the long run. Relationships that are constantly held up by one person's effort aren't balanced. But when silence prompts the other person to step back and recognize the imbalance, or even just the impact of your presence, things start to change. The challenge here is emotional discipline. It's tempting to fill the silence, to reach out when you feel uncertain, to clarify your intentions, but doing so robs the other person of the very opportunity to reflect. It interrupts the process that could lead them to clarity. And clarity, once reached internally, often leads to authentic re-engagement. Not because you demanded it, but because they chose it. You might notice this shift in subtle ways. They reach out without prompting. They reference things you used to talk about. Their tone becomes more intentional. These aren't random actions. They're signals of reflection that's taken place during the silence. Whether they express it directly or not, your absence started a conversation in their mind. And that conversation is often far more powerful than anything you could have said out loud. Going silent creates the space where awareness grows. It's in that space that someone has the chance to realize not only that they miss you, but why they miss you. And that why is the emotional seed that grows genuine connection. So if you're willing to hold that silence, to let them come to their own realizations without rushing to fill the gap, You give the connection a chance to deepen in a way that constant words and effort simply can't achieve. Most people misunderstand the idea of going silent. They think it's about creating confusion, about pulling away just to get a reaction, or even punishing the other person for not showing up in the way they want. But when done correctly, silence isn't manipulation, it's a reset. A purposeful disconnection is not about withholding affection, it's about restoring balance in a dynamic that has become skewed, especially when one person is doing all the emotional labor. People overextend themselves in the early stages of a relationship or even deep into one because they believe constant effort equals security. They believe that if they're always available, always understanding, always giving, they'll eventually receive the same in return. But what often happens instead is that the other person gets comfortable. They come to expect that level of emotional giving without realizing what it costs. That's when things begin to feel one-sided. That's when you start to feel unseen, unappreciated, or emotionally exhausted. Purposeful disconnection is the antidote to that imbalance. It's the moment where you stop pouring into someone else's cup long enough to notice that your own is empty. It's not about ghosting, and it's certainly not about mind games. It's about making a conscious choice to step back, not in anger, not in fear, but in clarity. You are giving yourself room to breathe, and at the same time, giving the relationship space to reveal its truth. Think of it this way. When you're always plugged in to someone emotionally, you become hyper aware of their needs, their moods, their words, their inconsistencies. You may begin to absorb their energy, their indecision, or even their neglect. But when you disconnect with purpose, you reclaim your perspective. You shift the focus from what do they want to what do I want. That single question has the power to reframe the entire connection. And here's the part most people miss. This kind of silence isn't passive. It's not sitting by the phone, hoping someone reaches out. It's active, intentional, and reflective. During this time, you are reconnecting with your identity outside of that person. You're revisiting your passions, your boundaries, your voice. You're not waiting, you're rebuilding. And that subtle but important difference is what gives your absence weight. Because when you go silent and do the work on yourself in that silence, something starts to shift, not just in how they see you, but in how you see yourself. You're no longer emotionally dependent on their attention to feel validated. You're not needing their call or message to feel worthy. You're reclaiming the part of yourself that you may have unconsciously handed over in pursuit of love or connection. And when the other person senses that shift, it creates a ripple. Suddenly, you're not the person waiting for their energy, you're the person with energy of your own. You become someone they can't quite pin down in the way they used to. You've pulled your attention inward, and that change is felt. It invites curiosity, it invites reevaluation. In many cases, it invites respect. But even more important than how they respond is what you come to realize in that space. Sometimes, when you're no longer distracted by their presence or their inconsistency, you begin to see things clearly. You start to notice the ways you've been bending. You see where your standards were quietly lowered in the name of connection, and you begin to ask better questions. Does this dynamic honor me? This person meeting me with the same energy I'm bringing? Am I trying to make something work that was never mutual? That clarity is invaluable. It empowers you to either re-enter the connection with stronger boundaries or walk away with peace. Either way, you've shifted the power dynamic, not by force, but by focus. You didn't try to control them, you simply redirected your energy. And in doing so, you transform the silence into something meaningful. Purposeful disconnection isn't about creating distance just for the sake of it. It's about using space to realign, to return to yourself, to stop fighting for someone else's presence and start standing fully in your own. And from that place of quiet strength, everything becomes clearer. Not just what you deserve, but what you're no longer willing to accept. Silence is often misunderstood as waiting. People assume that when you go silent in a relationship or connection, the only thing to do is pause your life and hope the other person notices, reaches out, or changes. But that kind of silence, where you're frozen, watching your phone, wondering what they're thinking, isn't power. It's anxiety disguised as strategy. Real silence, the kind that shifts dynamics and deepens your own self-worth, is not passive. It's active. It's not about doing nothing. It's about doing the right things for you during that space. So what should you be doing during this silence? This period of silence is a return to center. It's a time to re-engage with your goals, your health, your friendships, your passions, the things that made you you before they even came into the picture. Maybe you dive back into creative work. Maybe you start investing more energy into your fitness or your self-care. Maybe you just start spending more time with people who remind you of your worth, instead of waiting to be reminded by someone who's been unsure about you. When you're focused on self-expansion during this silence, you stop orbiting around them. Your world grows bigger, not smaller. And that growth sends a message, not because you're trying to send one, but because your energy naturally shifts. You're no longer stuck in a loop of waiting, guessing, overthinking. You're moving, and movement is magnetic. When someone feels your absence and then sees your evolution, it creates a moment of dissonance for them. They remember who you were when you were available, and they see who you're becoming now that you've stepped away. That contrast can be powerful. It's not about showing off. It's not about provoking jealousy or chasing validation. It's simply about being seen as someone who doesn't pause her life for someone else's indecision. And that's incredibly